All right, so first in this panel, I'm presenting, so I probably shouldn't be chairing. But firstly, I'm very happy to introduce Carmen Levick from the School of English, who's going to be delivering a presentation, Taxonomies of Pain, Identities and Belonging in Post-Communist Eastern Europe. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you all hear me at the back? Perfect. First of all, I'd like to thank Alex Woodall, who's not here today, but who invited me to speak today. And the way in which I kind of fit my research into whatever definition we have for cultural industries is that I'm looking at processes of commemoration. So I'm looking at museums and I'm looking at kind of places or spaces of commemoration. I have a little presentation. I hope it's not too kind of detailed. I try to show you exactly what my new project is on, but also to kind of see how us in the School of English can kind of fit within this larger network of research. So my current research is on Eastern Europe, mainly Romania, Hungary and former Yugoslavia, especially Kosovo. And I'm looking at the kind of a mixture of processes of commemoration. I'm looking at the way in which Eastern Europe commemorates the Holocaust and the way in which they commemorate communism and how those two clash. So the kind of the key arguments that I have, and this is where this work is coming from. I worked with people from Holland and Germany on a project that was called European Belonging, and during that research I kind of looked into how Eastern Europeans see themselves as belonging to the European family, especially before accession. So when you accede to the EU, you have to, as a country, you have to prove that you are mature culturally. And that cultural maturity includes the idea of commemorating the Holocaust. The Holocaust is a kind of a standing item on the way in which the EU kind of looks at countries that want to accede to the EU, and if the processes of commemoration of the Holocaust are okay from the point of view of cultural value and kind of cultural maturity, then the country kind of can tick off that box. So I started looking into the ways in which Eastern European countries, especially Romania and Hungary, who had a very clear kind of connection to the Holocaust, how they started commemorating the Holocaust just before trying to get into the EU. So I'm looking at the process of belonging, that idea of longing to be or longing to belong. And that is connected to this idea of institutional validation of what Europeanness means. And I'm writing Europeanness with EU because I mean Europeanness by the way in which the EU kind of sets out what does it mean to be European, rather than a kind of a more philosophical idea of Europeanness. And I'm looking at scholars from Bulgaria and from Eastern Europe, from the former Soviet republics, like Maria Todorova and Madina Tlostanova, who are both writing about this idea of belonging, the idea of identity, and how communities in Eastern Europe work on that, and how can they kind of connect their past, which is quite grey and maybe kind of unwanted in their kind of view, and their present, which is very much kind of their connection with the EU, but also the connection with NATO. And according to Todorova, so what Todorova and Tlostanova are talking about is this idea of connecting the Balkans and that area of Eastern Europe with discourses of post-colonial processes, which are very much not including Eastern Europe. However, scholars in Eastern Europe feel that their connection with both the Soviet Union in the past and now with the EU has elements of what kind of colonial kind of relationships were like in the past. And this kind of argument is really based on kind of research from as way back as 1946, where W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about the Balkans and about Eastern Europe as semi-colonial. So what he says is that, you know, the role of specific cultural objects in the definition and implementation of both local identities and European narratives of belonging in the fluctuant space of quasi-colonial. So what he calls kind of semi or quasi-colonial. So those are the spaces that I'm looking at. And also what Laura Doyle kind of identifies as inter-imperial. So there are these kind of very messy spaces that I'm looking at. And within those messy spaces, I'm looking at particular case studies, which are buildings or museums, and their connection with space and identity. Now, the methodologies that I'm using are very complicated in the sense that I'm coming from theatre studies. So kind of my main knowledge is in performance studies and theatre studies. So I had to start from somewhere and kind of pan out towards what became memory studies and identity studies and all those other studies. So it's more like cultural studies than anything else. But the basic methodology that I'm using is performance studies, and I'm mainly looking at performance studies scholar called Carmen Levick, who's talking about the kind of the modernist terminology of dérive, of kind of walking through space or engaging with space. But what he says is that this space or this engagement with space always has a political element. So how politics and kind of external things or historical events impact on people in these spaces. So the kind of performance studies is at the basis of my research, and then performance studies is kind of enriched by memory studies, by trauma studies, and post-colonial, decolonial studies. So it's quite a wide range of fields that I'm kind of looking at. And within that, I'm looking at the kind of the way in which performance studies can shed specific light on the way in which people engage with commemorative practices. So how do people engage with commemorating the Holocaust? How do people engage with commemorating communism? And how those two kind of interact with each other. And for that, I have a variety of case studies that I'm looking at, and I'm lucky enough to be able to go to these places and stay there for a bit of time in the second semester of next year. So the case studies, I kind of put up some of them for you to understand what I'm looking at. So the first case study, so I'm looking at this idea of competitive martyrdom that Timothy Snyder is talking about, where the Holocaust and communism kind of clash with each other, and how those define these ideas of identity in Eastern Europe. So the spaces that I'm looking at and the museums I'm looking at and monuments are, the first one is the Elie Wiesel Memorial House, which is in Sighetu Marmației in Romania. And it stands kind of opposite or with another commemorative space, which is the Memorial of the Victims of Communism and of the Resistance in the same city. So these two spaces kind of are, there is a street in between them, but you can see when you go and see them, you see the difference in funding, for example, so the funding that they get from the government, but also the way in which local people and tourists engage with these spaces. So these are two of the case studies that I'm looking at. But I'm also looking at other spaces that have popped up recently in Romania and Hungary. And these are connected to this kind of European push to commemorate the Holocaust. And these are a new storytelling museum called Muzeon, which was created in Cluj-Napoca in Romania. So it's called the Storytelling Jewish History Museum, where the objects are kind of brought to life by storytelling and also kind of virtual reality, kind of interactive spaces that they created. Another one is the Museum of Jewish History in the Acra Shrine Synagogue in Oradea in Romania, where the the kind of the religious spaces that were left to rot during communism are kind of brought back to life by European funding, which is then connected to the need or the kind of this idea of fitting within the value, the cultural values of the EU. So they get the money, they have to reconstruct often these spaces and then create museums within them. And that makes them kind of create a particular narrative that informs these spaces. And then another one that I'm looking at is the Hungarian Jewish Museum at the Great Synagogue in Budapest, which is the kind of the main Jewish history museum in Hungary. And I'm looking at the ways in which the current political situation in Hungary, which is very much kind of going against Jewish values and against the idea of Jewishness, with loads of national posters about George Soros, for example, and how the kind of the funding and the political kind of the current political situation in the country influences these spaces and the way in which they kind of create a narrative of identity and belonging, however often an identity that seems artificial or artificially kind of sustained. So this is it, I think, for me. These are the kind of, this is the thing that I'm working on. So if you have any specific questions, I'm happy to respond. But I hope that this research network can allow for discussions, at least with people from architecture, for example, or people from politics who might work on the kind of the same area or on issues or similar issues that I'm working on. So thank you, Mark.
Great, thank you.